For 45 years, they told the world one thing in every language, in every forum, in every negotiation that ever took place between Tehran and the rest of civilization. They said they would never give it up. Not under sanctions, not under military strikes, not under the most suffocating economic siege any nation has endured in the modern era. The enriched uranium was never simply a weapons program to the Islamic Republic. It was the regime's reason for existing, its claim to regional supremacy, the card that made every enemy think twice before acting, the invisible hand tilting every negotiation in Tehran's favor before a single word was spoken. Every threat from Washington, every ultimatum from Tel Aviv, every military exercise in the Persian Gulf landed with less weight because of what Iran was quietly telling the world it could become. And then, without warning, came a statement so extraordinary that serious people read it twice just to confirm what they were reading. Iran has agreed not to possess nuclear weapons. Iran has agreed to surrender its stockpiles of enriched uranium, and they have agreed to it very powerfully. Not a ceasefire, not a temporary suspension, not an inspection protocol pause. Iran could quietly walk back in 6 months once the pressure eased. A surrender, a full, explicit, publicly announced surrender of the most strategically significant asset the Islamic Republic has ever possessed. The red line the Revolutionary Guards declared. For decades they would die before crossed. And the way it happened, without a single American soldier setting foot on Iranian soil, without an airborne operation into underground mountain fortresses, is the part of the story that even Washington's most optimistic war planners did not fully anticipate. What just happened in Iran is one of the most consequential geopolitical events in the entire history of the Middle East. The full weight of it has not yet landed on the world. When it does, nothing in this region will look the same. To understand why this moment is historically shattering, you need to understand what that uranium actually was, not technically, strategically. The 2015 nuclear agreement had constrained Iran's enrichment program to 3.67% purity with a stockpile ceiling of 300 kilograms under continuous international inspection. It was a framework that kept Iran's nuclear capabilities at a calculated distance from weapons-grade material, a distance that neither Israel, Saudi Arabia, nor the United States could accept being closed. Then Trump withdrew from the deal during his first term, and Tehran released the brakes, first to 20%, then to 60%. By June of 2025, Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% had exceeded 440 kilograms. That is enough fissile material properly processed for more than 10 nuclear warheads, the time frame experts call breakout time, the period between a political decision to build a weapon and the technical capacity to detonate one had collapsed to something approaching zero. For Israel, this was not an abstract security concern. It was an existential nightmare with a running clock accelerating every single month. For Saudi Arabia, a nuclear-capable Tehran represented the end of whatever strategic equilibrium the Gulf had maintained. For the United States, a nuclear-armed Iran in a region where Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey had each privately communicated they would respond in kind meant the most dangerous proliferation cascade since the Cold War. The uranium was distributed across 3 underground fortresses built specifically to survive American and Israeli airstrikes. Natanz, buried in mountain terrain surrounded by reinforced concrete. Isfahan, holding roughly half the stockpile in tunnels more than 90 meters underground, and Fordo, built entirely inside a mountain, engineered to resist the most powerful conventional munitions in existence. The June 2025 strikes had severely damaged these facilities, but here's what those strikes could not solve. Uranium enriched to 60% does not disappear through radioactive decay. It does not degrade. It can remain at weapons-relevant enrichment levels for hundreds of years. The bombs destroyed the infrastructure. They could not destroy the material. And the material, given time and a regime still standing, can always be reconstructed around. This is what drove the Pentagon to present Trump with a ground operation plan that defense officials describe as a logistics nightmare more complex than anything since Normandy. The 82nd Airborne would paradrop into hostile territory and construct a runway from scratch under fire. Delta Force and Navy SEAL teams would blast through 300 feet of rubble to reach tunnels 90 meters underground. Operators in hazmat suits would advance step by step through environments where one mistake meant permanent contamination, sustained under continuous Iranian missile and drone attacks for weeks. Former senior defense officials called it something they could not in good conscience recommend. Trump looked at that plan, and then he looked at a 21-mile strait in the Persian Gulf, and he chose the strait. On April 13th, the United States Navy declared a full blockade of Iranian ports at the Strait of Hormuz. Shadow fleet vessels that had moved Iranian oil through back channels for years were turned back without exception. 97% of Iran's oil was flowing to China before the blockade began. American destroyers redirected Chinese-linked tankers. Regardless of Beijing's objections, the surveillance architecture was total. The enforcement was complete. But the blockade did not simply stop oil. The bulk of Iran's food imports came by sea. Wheat, rice, cooking oil, pharmaceutical materials, spare parts for industrial equipment, all of it moved through Hormuz. The blockade sealed both ends of Iran's economic circulatory system simultaneously. Nothing went out. Nothing came in. And in Tehran's highest decision-making rooms, the people who understood the true numbers, did the mathematics the blockade forced them to confront. Within 10 days, oil wells would begin shutting down from storage overflow, and once shut, some would never fully recover. Within 10 days, food stock buffers in major cities would begin running thin. Within 10 days, industrial facilities dependent on imported raw materials would start going dark. Within 10 days, the money sustaining every function of the Iranian state, from soldier salaries to proxy network financing to government subsidies that maintain the last threads of the social contract with the Iranian people, would be effectively zero. And here's where the regime's fundamental contradiction became impossible to ignore. Uranium enriched to 60% is a bargaining chip, a powerful one, a decades-long investment in leverage and deterrence. But what does a regime do with enriched uranium when its economy has collapsed? What does a government accomplish with a nuclear program when its people cannot find basic fuel? What does the Revolutionary Guard protect with its sacred stockpile? When the regime itself is 2 weeks from total structural failure, the Hormuz blockade answered the question no amount of previous sanctions had ever forced Iran to confront at this speed and with this finality. Uranium is a bargaining chip. Hormuz is a matter of regime survival. When those two things come into direct conflict, only one determines whether the regime exists next month. Iran came to the table, and it brought the uranium. But here's the layer of this story the headline cannot capture. The layer more dangerous than the agreement itself. The layer that will determine whether what was announced actually happens in the physical world. Iran is not a homogeneous structure governed from a single coherent center. It never has been. And right now, it is more internally fractured than at any point in its post-revolutionary history. On one side stands President Masoud Pezeshkian, who wanted a ceasefire before the war reached its current catastrophic intensity. He has been publicly warning, in language extraordinary for a sitting Iranian president, that the economy will completely collapse within 3 weeks. He is the face of the faction that understands the regime cannot survive the economic trajectory the Revolutionary Guard's war strategy has produced. His position on the uranium is pragmatic in the coldest sense. Hand it over, lift the blockade, keep the regime standing. Institutional humiliation, yes. A retreat from 45 years of declared principle, yes. But a regime that is humiliated still exists. A regime that is economically annihilated in 14 days does not. On the other side stands IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi. And what Vahidi has been doing while negotiations proceeded is not passive objection. It is active seizure of state functions. Vahidi has been blocking presidential appointments, filling intelligence ministry positions himself outside the constitutional process, pressuring the Supreme National Security Council to be reshaped with figures aligned to the Guard's interests, seizing executive powers that constitutionally belong to the civilian government. Pezeshkian formally demanded those powers be returned. Vahidi refused absolutely. This is not a policy disagreement between two branches of government. This is a constitutional coup being executed in slow motion inside a regime, simultaneously trying to negotiate with Washington, manage a popular uprising across dozens of cities, maintain military operations with soldiers deserting in groups, and prevent economic collapse now 2 weeks away. And above both of them, providing neither clarity nor resolution, floats the ghost of constitutional authority itself. Mojtaba Khamenei, declared supreme leader after his father's death, almost never seen in public, constitutionally commander-in-chief of all Iranian armed forces. In practice, Vahidi is running the command. The legitimacy vacuum created by a supreme leader who cannot function is the single most critical enabler of the Guard's power seizure. Every decision requiring authorization that cannot be obtained means the entity willing to act without authorization wins the institutional contest. The IRGC is willing to act without authorization. That is the entire point of what Vahidi has been doing. Now place the uranium handover into this picture and ask the question every intelligence service watching Tehran is asking. Can the IRGC sabotage this agreement? The answer technically is yes. It could obstruct the physical handover, block access to facilities, delay inspections, create bureaucratic friction, extending the timeline indefinitely while publicly claiming good faith compliance. It could move stockpiles to locations Iran has never officially acknowledged. The IAEA has consistently documented that Iran's declared nuclear activities do not account for all of its nuclear activities. Material moved before the handover cannot be verified as missing until inspectors have unrestricted access to every facility the Guard controls. It could underreport, declaring a portion surrendered while retaining a concealed reserve, preserving the technical option. It is publicly abandoning. The declared stockpile becomes the verified stockpile. The undeclared remainder becomes the insurance policy. These options exist. Whether they can be executed in practice depends on one specific question. Does the IRGC believe it can survive? What happens if Trump concludes Iran is not complying? Because that is an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do to a man with 3 carrier strike groups in the region and a ground operation plan already on a shelf. The Revolutionary Guard faces 3 options, and none of them lead to anywhere good. Option 1. Accept the uranium handover. Institutional suicide for the organization that built its entire identity around protecting that stockpile. The resistance narrative collapses entirely, but the regime survives, and a surviving regime is a platform from which rebuilding eventually becomes possible. Option 2. Sabotage the agreement and continue the war. This invites Trump to play every remaining card simultaneously. The blockade intensifies. The ceasefire collapses. The ground operation that defense officials called a logistics nightmare stops being a plan on a shelf and becomes an operational order and execution. The entire architecture of the most complex military operation since Normandy becomes the IRGC's direct consequence for choosing defiance. Option 3. Internal coup, toppling Pezeshkian's government, declaring military rule, terminating the diplomatic process. This removes the last faction arguing for regime preservation through negotiation and hands the Iranian state to the organization whose strategy has produced the current catastrophe. It would be hammering the final nail into an already collapsing structure. All 3 options mean devastating loss for the Revolutionary Guard. The calculus of which loss is most survivable is the calculation being made in Tehran right now, in the dangerous space between Trump's announcement and Iran's official confirmation that has still not come. The regional implications of this moment are already reshaping the Middle East strategic architecture before the ink on any formal agreement has dried. For Israel, the Iranian nuclear handover removes the single threat dominating its national security planning for 2 decades. The nuclear dimension, the scenario driving successive Israeli governments to maintain strike capability against underground facilities across a hostile region, has been formally placed on the table for surrender. Within hours of the announcement, Netanyahu signaled readiness to engage in Lebanon ceasefire talks. The timing was not coincidental. With the nuclear shadow removed, every other regional negotiation recalculates entirely. Hezbollah, without Iranian nuclear backing, is a structurally different organization. The psychological architecture of Iran's proxy network was always built partly around the implied protection of the nuclear deterrent standing behind it. Remove that deterrent and every proxy organization recalculates its risk exposure without that protection. For Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, the relief is existential but complicated by what comes next. The nightmare scenario of a nuclear-armed Iran triggering a regional proliferation cascade has been avoided, but the Gulf states are not simply breathing relief and returning to previous positions. They are moving actively and with unmistakable strategic intent, because the lesson of the past months is not simply that Iran's nuclear program is gone. The lesson is that Iran's entire strategic architecture, the Hormuz control doctrine, the proxy network, the resistance economy, the deterrence through nuclear ambiguity, all of it has been exposed as more fragile than anyone believed. And fragility, once publicly revealed at this scale, invites permanent strategic response. The most consequential long-term development emerging from this crisis is not the uranium handover. It is what the Gulf states are doing about Hormuz, because the Islamic Republic has used its capacity to close that strait as its ultimate diplomatic weapon for 4 decades. The threat that Iran could choke 20% of the world's oil supply by closing a 21-mile waterway was the structural foundation of Tehran's leverage in every room it entered. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have concluded that this leverage must be permanently eliminated, not managed, not deterred. Eliminated architecturally by removing the geographic dependency that made the leverage possible. Massive bypass pipelines and canal projects are now underway across the Arabian Peninsula, routes designed to carry Gulf oil to global markets without ever transiting Hormuz. The engineering ambition involves investment measured in hundreds of billions of dollars and timelines measured in years. But the strategic logic is not economic. It is geopolitical and permanent. When Gulf oil can reach global markets without touching Hormuz, the Islamic Republic's ultimate card is canceled without a military strike, without any Iranian agreement or cooperation. The geography itself is being re-engineered to make the threat impossible to execute, rather than simply deterred against. But between Trump's announcement and that permanent future lies the most dangerous period of this entire crisis. The hours and days immediately following a forced public capitulation by an organization like the Revolutionary Guard are not hours of stability. They are hours when the internal calculation being made by men like Vahidi reaches its most acute and most unpredictable point. Because the IRGC's entire institutional narrative, the story it tells itself, and the Iranian people and its proxy partners about why it exists, why it controls so much of the economy, why it demands the budgets and privileges and authority that it does, rests entirely on the claim of unbreakable resistance. That claim just broke publicly, announced by the American president, attributed to Iranian acceptance, broadcast to every government and every proxy organization, told for 45 years that the uranium was the red line that would never be crossed. Hezbollah is running the math right now. The Houthis are running the math. Iraqi militias across the region are running the math. If Iran surrendered its nuclear card under 2 weeks of economic pressure, what does that tell us about the value of the protection we were promised? If the IRGC's most sacred commitment could be reversed in 14 days of naval blockade, what is its commitment to our survival actually worth? Those questions once asked cannot be unasked. The proxy network was sustained for decades by the perception of Iranian power, reliability, and willingness to sacrifice for the cause. Perception once shattered at this scale does not reassemble around a press release. It requires years of demonstrated capacity to rebuild. Iran does not have years, and the Iranian people, who the regime state television assured had overwhelming war support in a poll from a source never named or verified, are standing in fuel lines in an oil-producing country, watching the regime that told them their sacrifices were necessary and historically destined surrender, the centerpiece of that destiny to the country it has called the Great Satan since 1979. The 2009 Green Movement erupted from a stolen election. The 2019 uprising erupted from a gasoline price increase. The 2022 wave erupted from a young woman dying in police custody. Each was triggered by a single visible injustice crystallizing accumulated grievance into organized mass protest. The current conditions are heavier than all three of those moments combined. Economic collapse, military defeat, and diplomatic surrender are happening simultaneously and in full public view. The trigger that ignites the next wave does not need to be dramatic. The kindling is already everywhere.